what can a managed identity be used for? Today, you can use managed identities to authenticate to any cloud service that supports Azure AD authentication and some form of authorization, perhaps Azure RBAC. Once you have a managed identity, you can request tokens via a token endpoint on the resource, let's say a virtual machine. They have an endpoint where you can request tokens for a particular audience. So let's say I have a virtual machine. I can say, please give me a token. I need to talk to Key Vault. And then as long as I've been granted access to Key Vault, I can use that token to authenticate and maybe perhaps pull some keys from Key Vault or any other secret. Similarly, if I have a managed identity on, let's say, that same virtual machine, I can request a different token, but for storage. And if I've been given an Azure RBAC role assignment to storage, I can use that token to authenticate and maybe read data or push data to storage. So as long as the service that you're trying to authenticate to supports Azure AD authentication and has an authorization form, preferably Azure RBAC, then you're good to go and you can use that managed identity in your workload.
Hey everybody, it's me, it's Jay Gordon. Welcome back once again to AzureFunBytes. Every week we get together, what do? We talk about the products that make up the foundations and the fundamentals of using Azure. And so we get together, we talk, we answer questions. So make sure that you are taking part. If you have the ability to, please go ahead, leave some questions in the chat. It's going to be a ton of information today about managed identity. If you go ahead and you head over right now to LearnTV, there is a poll up. And I think what we're going to do before we kind of get started is let's take a look at this week's poll. All right. And so this week's poll right over here. Do you have Azure Managed Identities configured for your deployment process? So why don't you go ahead, head over to LearnTV if you're not already there. You can watch the show here. See, here we are. So watch the show right there from LearnTV. Hey, there's me. And so go ahead, take our poll. I'd really love to hear from you. And always, I'd love you to ask questions. And so to ask questions, like I said, there is the chat there on LearnTV, or you can use your native chats if you're on Twitch or YouTube. I will see them. So let's get into what we're going to talk about this week. And I think that we looked at it just a minute ago on our intro. I had played you a video that gives you just a brief introduction to managed identities. But the person that's going to come on with me today's episode and explain to me a little bit more about managed identities is Peter DeTender. Hi, Peter. How are you?
Hey, Jay. Good afternoon for you, evening for me. I'm doing fine. And what about yourself?
I'm really good. Can you tell everybody where it is you're in the world right now?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I'm based out of Belgium, the small country that you should know from chocolate, beer, waffles, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you very, very much for your waffles. I think we of the rest of the planet are very, very thankful for them. And so, as always, Peter, I want you to know that we're going to have people who are interactive and they're part of this. They're going to ask questions like I mentioned before. And so we want them to send those comments and questions in the chat. I know, Peter, you're really happy and willing to help us get a better understanding of managed identities. But before we do, I want to ask you, so I normally have a lot of cloud advocates on here, but you have kind of a different role as a technical trainer. I'd love to hear like how you got here into that particular role.
Sure. So, well, the question that I always get is like, why is it that within Microsoft, it's one of the most obvious job roles ever? Because the official title is Azure Technical Trainer. Mm-hmm. So yes, my profession within Microsoft is being an Azure Technical Trainer, which means providing Azure training to our top customers and partners all over the world, where now, since COVID last year, we switched to virtual. Before that, it was literally traveling EMEA. That was my prime region. and providing in-person training. So how did I get here? Before I joined Microsoft about 2 years back now, I was running my own business as a mainly Azure trainer. And before that, I came from the consulting world, working from different partners in Belgium. Initially, small SMB customers, then moved up to European customers. And out of my own business was helping global customers with training, architecting, some hands-on implementation, and it could be in any different order. So I could start with helping them in architecting like a cloud migration project, for example, and literally doing the migration for them, and then afterwards training the internal teams. Or it could start from a training roadshow roadmap, couple of days, sometimes a couple of weeks, and eventually like, hey, we're actually getting into Azure, but we got some questions. Would you mind stepping in again and helping us architecting it, maybe doing some hands-on coaching? But my preference would still be the training world. That's really
Gotcha.
my passion.
Yeah, I really love helping people better understand things. That's why I do this every week, because I think that it's worth it to kind of cover all the bases, to ensure that people understand what it is they're getting themselves into when they take on the cloud. Because let's be honest with you, not every single thing is cut and dry. There's a lot of nuance to being in using the cloud in different ways. And one of those nuances is obviously security. There's a ton that has to go into, like we could talk about all the DevOps in the world. We could talk about all these different processes, but without being able to secure our automation, our applications, how everything is configured, even our credentials that go back and forth, we're simply not going to provide our users with the best experience.
Well, no, that's correct. And I think you mentioned DevOps because, I mean, your audience already knows like what you're doing. So you probably need to mention DevOps like every couple of minutes. I don't know. But what you said is correct, that it all starts and goes back to security, where, yeah, even the complexity as like one of the core domains why I like delivering training is exactly what you said. It's moving from what you have into this cool, might be one word, maybe complex, but that should be wrong. Although we're not always making it that easy, because it's moving to cloud, it's moving security concepts, it's making it a bit more straightforward, but you're also a little bit losing like touch on certain security topics because it's not your data center anymore. And I can imagine that, yeah, customers are really worried about like, yeah, but I locked down my virtual machine where now my VM is connecting to my SQL database server. And in between, there's some firewall stuff going on. But once I move to cloud, and do I still have the same security? Or even before that, like, how can I make sure that not just any of my admins are like full cloud admins, right?
Sure,
So
sure. Simple like access and management is still one of the more critical things, even when we're not talking about traditional bare metal environments or you know, I think the more we kind of look at automation and how we can ensure automation in our processes will continue to mean that we're going to have, you know, the best potential delivery of value to our end users. And that's one of the big things we talk about in DevOps, especially here in the Azure team around DevOps, is we always talk about, and there's that Donovan Brown kind of definition of DevOps. And I think that, you know, we're constantly using people and process to elevate the work we do so we can have deliver the most value. And so I think that's super, super important. And so I wanted to remind you of one thing that, you know, we've been talking about education, and continuous learning is such a tremendous part of your DevOps experience, of your cloud experience. And so if you want, there is some free education for you that you can go to, hopefully after the show, and learn a lot more about these subjects. Matter of fact, there is an entire module all over this particular subject. And also, if you'd like to get into the big fundamentals of Azure, there is an entire learning path related to Azure fundamentals. And so you can go along that path and get your AZ900 if you want. And I think it's a great certificate. It gives you that kind of solid foundation that we all believe can help you get the most out of Azure. Cool. So why don't we talk a little bit more about managed identity today, Peter? And the one thing I wanted to go ahead.
No,
Okay.
go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that. And so the one thing I wanted to do is just bring up this definition that we've got here. It's right from the Microsoft Azure website. It's you're going to protect applications and data at the front gate with Azure Identity Access Management solutions. You can defend against malicious login attempts, safeguard credentials with risk-based access controls, identity protection tools, and strong auth options without disrupting your productivity. And I think that's the big part, Peter. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think productivity in creating these managed identities, to me, is one of the biggest parts, because we're not relying on having to provide credentials all the time. We're not having to when we're doing deployments.
Yeah, and why I like the definition, obviously, because it's pretty complete. But on the other side, it's maybe having some complexity as well. Now, you mentioned that we're going to talk about managed identities, and that's ultimately what we're going to do. But for me, managed identities is like a bit more towards the end of like what I would like to talk about in the next 45, 50 minutes.
Sure.
And the easy way to get it, now you mentioned complexity in the beginning. And I mean, we have the Learn modules, we have LearnTV. I'm super excited to be on LearnTV, by the way. But next to that, it's not always clear, like, what does it actually mean? Like when we talk about service principals, what about managed identities? Maybe some in the audience, or maybe not right now, but maybe later on as the recording, you might have heard about MSIs, like managed service identities. And it's, in the end, it's all the same thing. I could throw in another one that's an app registration, where in the end, it all comes back to being an identity object. Now, as you can see, I got my whiteboard open because it's just a bit easier and hopefully a bit more entertaining than flipping slides. But
Sure.
if you look at like our Azure environment, you basically deploy your resources, right? So let's say this is a virtual machine, and we might have a web app later on. And you mentioned Key Vault, I think, or our colleague in the video mentioned Key Vault. For the ones who don't know, I'll walk you through a scenario later. It's where you would store your secrets, like certificates, anything that's a little bit confidential, or literally like a connection string from a database server would be another example. Now, you start with your admin account, right? So let's draw Peter up here. And as you know, Peter likes waffles. So that's Peter. And Peter is a traditional admin, which means we have our on-prem data center where we typically run similar components than in cloud. So we have a collection of servers, let's say a web server and SQL server, or any other database server, not really that important. Where Peter, being the admin, I can manage my data center. And depending a bit on how good I do my job, I don't know, I might get access to everything. I might get limited access. So imagine that Peter is my e-commerce environment admin, which means Peter can touch these components in my data center, but nothing else. Gotcha. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like a Windows admin. That was my job, like, I don't know, 20 years ago, managing Windows systems, deploying IIS, deploying database components, and managing them. But I could only manage that little part. We're now moving to cloud. You're not really changing anything. So Peter logs on to the Azure portal. Where now, out of that identity management, I can define, or maybe my supervisor can define, that when I'm logging on to Azure, I can manage that virtual machine that's running my e-commerce website. I could manage the web app services, I could manage database services, but I cannot touch Key Vault because inside Key Vault, there's where all the secrets are. And I'm just a regular admin, so I don't need access to Key Vault. But later, my virtual machine where my web app is running needs access to the connection string because we're not going to store that inside our application settings file anymore. That would be the main idea. Now, that's just the introduction where I hope at least in the audience that you understand an admin account gets access to Azure resources, and based on role-based access control, that's the service we're going to use. You can define,
or we call it RBAC. Just want to make sure everybody, there's a great, just acronym for it that we call for role-based access control. That's RBAC. You may hear that a lot on your journey through a lot of these processes. So just wanted to kind of set that little context of RBAC, role-based access control, if you haven't or you have heard of the term before.
Now, quickly showing you what this looks like. Let's jump to a virtual machine where I got my web VM. We migrated to Azure, by the way, for the ones who don't know. I think last week, a couple of weeks back, I think out of the Cloud Advocate team, you started some Azure migrate journey.
Yeah.
To migrate on-prem VMs to the cloud.
Yeah, myself and Abel, we had a session for a series that you can find on the DevOps Lab called On-Prem to the Cloud, where we looked at all the different scenarios of how to bring on-premises infrastructure into the cloud, whether it's lift and shift or using native services.
Cool. So if you're not watching that one yet, I could definitely recommend it. So from here, we have identity and access management, where within we're going to define role-based access. Like a role could be almost any admin level permission that you want to grant. So if I'm like the virtual machine admin, I could dive into existing roles. I could customize, but not going to talk too much about that today. But out of that list of roles, if it shows me up here, there we go. You can be an owner, which means you got pretty much all permissions, including changing security permissions like access permissions. A typical admin role would be a contributor, which means that you can manage that resource. Could also be allocated on a resource group, could be managed on a subscription level if you want. So a couple of different levels in the hierarchy, because you're not going to define this per individual resource. If you have like my application, I'll walk you through later on. It's based on a collection of web servers, database servers. I have a similar example using functions. I got a similar example using Azure Web Apps, which means I can manage all resources in my e-commerce application resource group to just make it a bit more straightforward. Now, why is this important? Because it starts with that identity object. My admin account, PE Tender, is the admin account of my subscription and locking down what I can do inside my subscription. Now, from here, we could take it one step further and allocating groups, because Peter is probably not managing the whole Azure environment by himself. So we're going to extend it and adding other admins, where all these are coming from. No secrets there. Azure Active Directory. So if you look in Azure Active Directory, where depending a bit on the permissions you get, you can see everything. Every now and then you can only see the user list or the group list. But in here we have our users. We have groups like the network admins, the database admins, HR, but that's probably not really IT admin level permission related, but just any group you have, you could integrate on-prem groups, replicate them using Azure AD Connect. So that's like a little intro on Active Directory from on-prem, reusing all the users, all the admins, and why not taking over the permissions, right? Because in the end, once you start moving into the cloud, you're not going to change those permissions. Now, there's no, I would say, an immediate migration option like my network admins today will become network admins in Azure, but that's specifically what RBAC is giving you. Now, from here, that's really the baseline. Azure AD, your identity source, and that's where everything is starting. So from here, let's move to our service principal concept. Do you know service principals? Because it's service principal, managed identities, app registration. It's all similar but slightly different. Should we
Hmm.
jump to service principals?
Yeah, let's do
Sure.
it. Absolutely.
Cool. So what is a service principal? It's an Azure AD object similar to like a Peter admin account, but this time it's not linked to a user. It's not linked to a group. It's like a service account. Remember in the traditional on-prem data center world, where you deployed like a backup service, you had a backup
Hmm.
solution, and your backup service account needed, or your backup software needed permissions to connect to the file server, connect to an Exchange server, connect to a database server, and getting access to read out all the files and stuff, right? So to grant that permission, you would not run your backup software using your root admin account. You would
Hmm.
also not configure it with your Peter admin account, because if Peter's leaving the organization for whatever reason and out of your user management, you would disable the Peter account. It means that the backup will fail as well. So
Sure.
that's why we talked about service accounts. You create an account in your identity system and you provide permissions. So what we're doing with Azure Service Principals is the exact same thing. Now, where could you use it? Easy said, in about any scenario where you have some kind of software. Think of um, Azure DevOps. Think
Hmm.
of Terraform. If you want to deploy Azure resources using infrastructure as code, you have Azure RM templates, but you could also use Terraform if you are not just using Azure, but maybe having a multi-cloud, then Terraform could be one of the examples.
Yeah,
Now, if you
I'd like to show everybody just a quick example of what it looks like. We'll get a little bit
way
deeper into
cool.
it, but let's take a quick look at this. So you can see right now what we're doing is we're creating that role-based authentication user, the service principal, using a CLI, create for RBAC, skip assignment, and the name. I create a resource group, and then what I'm doing is I'm creating a Kubernetes cluster. And so I'm specifying the service principal and client secret. And then eventually what I can do, and I'll show everybody in just a second, is I actually created a repo and with an automation script that I think is really really easy to kind of go through. Let me just bring this up for you really quickly. If you go to this repository, and it's right up here. What this repository does is contains just a little bash script that I put together, and it actually does a little bit of an all-in-one for you. So I need to kind of parameterize, so you can do this right through the CLI to create all this variables. But the thing that we do here is that we create our service principal first. We grab our username and or our app ID and password, which is essentially just our username and password, right, Peter?
Yep, that's it.
And
And the
then what
link
we're
to the subscription and the link to
Mhm.
the Azure AD tenant.
And then what we'll do is we'll go here, we'll create a resource group, we'll create that cluster like I showed you in the GIF. We'll get our credentials. Then what we're going to do is we create an Azure resource, excuse me, we create an Azure container registry. And so I'm going to want to automate pulls from the ACR over to my AKS cluster, my Azure Kubernetes Service cluster. And there's no reason for me to have to provide the username and password for that container registry every single time. That's overkill. So what you can do is you'll see here is we'll create a role assignment right here, and then I'll let you kind of take it from here, Peter, on what you got to show next. But I want to just give everybody a real world scenario that they can use right now on their own that implements this process. Because now I create the role assignment that tells it that we can do ACR pull from our Kubernetes cluster over to our ACR, and that gives us a little bit of additional security to automate that process. So I can go into my CI/CD and say, when a new container gets pushed into the container registry, kick that process off, and we don't need to worry about our credentials.
Way cool. And it's exactly what it means, right? So let me reuse your example and go back to my basics, right? Where we talked about like Peter the admin or my network admins or system admins, Azure AD group, where out of that service principle, let me get rid of our on-prem data center. Oh, come on. Just because I need some space on the whiteboard, that's all.
I love this whiteboard. This is really cool.
But I talked about like the service principle for like third-party integration, like the backup software or like Azure DevOps. So what we can do in our identity, everything here on the left would be my identity solutions, where now we have our service principle. So for example, the scenario you used is creating an Azure Kubernetes cluster. Now, for the ones who know a little bit about AKS or you don't know anything about AKS at all, it's Kubernetes as a service, which means that under the hood, it's deploying virtual machines, it's deploying the Kubernetes API server, it's deploying the network, it's deploying a load balancer and everything else.
Which you get a node pool. You get a node pool for all your nodes. You can increase the new node pool by adding auto scaling. They're all this like huge concepts that you don't need to do on your own.
Yep. Now, to be able to create all those resources in the back, it's not Peter the admin or somebody else who's doing it. It's literally that Kubernetes service. Now, there was one way that Jay showed you, like using that little script, and I would definitely recommend you to use that one. Now, to show you what it looks like if you deploy it from the portal, you go for Kubernetes service. I'm not going to deploy one because it takes about 15 minutes and I got a lot of other stuff to show you, but in one of the steps, it's going to ask you for authentication.
I see, and you've got your enabled and disabled for RBAC, system managed identity or a service principal. And so, if I'm right, if you select service principal, it'll give you the option to create your own default, or you can use an existing. So, if you have a service principal that you're already using for a certain process and you want to keep everything under the same, I wouldn't. I would create a service principal, and you can tell me if this is right. I would create a service principal that is specific to a task. I don't. Would you share service principles, or would you kind of keep them like singularly focused?
Yeah, I would try to I would say reuse a little bit of like the zero trust or the limited privilege. Like if you create this Kubernetes cluster, you create a service principal for the Kubernetes cluster. If you're going to use Azure DevOps and you have a pipeline, I'll show you the exact same scenario later on, you're going to create a service principal to run that specific pipeline. Or maybe out of that one single project, if you got multiple pipelines, that could be another option. But at least like trying to limit the permissions, the functionality of the service principal to that one resource or that one task, as you called it. Now, if you create a service principal, where it actually ends up is Azure AD. Remember, I told you we got managed identity, we got service principal, we got users and groups, and we also have app registration. So those are all different terminologies for the same concept and providing you the same functionality, which means that if all works out fine, I got my service principal for my AKS cluster. So I created my cluster long time ago, like November 19th. So I need to keep that in mind because one of the things you can do when you create a new service principal or app registration, it's valid for 1 year, 2 years. So it might be important to do some service principal management or service principal hygiene to pick up that information and making sure that obviously the credential is not like getting expired, because that would break the cluster functionality. So similar to your service account management in your on-prem world.
Plus, you may do something like you may spin up a new cluster every time you do new releases and destroy your old one and just modify things like DNS or something like that. And so then I would imagine that creating, new service principals would make a lot of sense, so that you're essentially rotating them in and out by just removing them. And that's the one thing that I've noticed that you always have to do is you need to manage your own service principals and delete the unused ones. So it may be worth it to create a job through something like a logic app that looks for ones that haven't been utilized and maybe gives you a report so that you know to delete them. That's just something that I've learned, because I'll be real. I was building a lot of Kubernetes clusters for demos, and I saw how many I had. It was wild, and I just had to go through and prune them.
Oh. And well, some other examples, and I'll switch to that in a minute. So there's a PE tender, ADO, so that's Azure DevOps, Terraform. There's a FastCard case and a list of other ones. Because the nice thing is, like if I go back to that third-party tool example, and I learned so much about Azure DevOps from your team, so why not giving a little bit back in this session, right? So I have my ADO. I got my ADO Terraform project up here. I got my FastCard case up here. So you could already figure out the logic that whenever you create a service principal, meaning you have your Azure DevOps project and you want to run a pipeline, it again is going to ask you for permissions, because although you log on to Azure DevOps using your Peter account, it means you get access to manage Azure DevOps. It doesn't mean that each and every pipeline you're going to run will always run in your Peter admin account permission. So when you drill down in your project and you create a pipeline, I don't need to explain you how to do that, but once you're going to run your pipeline, this one is pushing something into the Azure backend. So I'm running some CLI, and I'm targeting my Azure Resource Manager connection. Now, the way it works is from here, for each and every project, you can define service connections, where a service connection, it's nothing Azure DevOps specific. It means I need some kind of credentials to communicate with the target platform. So in this case, I'm targeting Azure. You could connect to Docker, for example. You can connect to Chef, to Puppet, to AWS, and a lot of other examples in this list, where the target environment is expecting credentials to validate, like, hey, foreign pipeline system, do you actually have permissions to touch my platform? That's literally what it means. So if we select Azure Resource Manager here, it's going to ask us for service principal in an automatic way, service principal in a manual way. Managed identity is not really used here. It's only if you use your own build servers, you would use managed identity. But if you have enough permissions, you could use service principal automatic. So what happens from here is that Azure DevOps reaches out to Azure AD, creates a new app registration / service principal, and providing me credentials. If I don't have the permissions, because again, I'm just a regular admin, I need to reach out to my typically security team, like, hey, can you provide me service principal to run this pipeline? And what it's going to do, that's the output from your script. You literally just going to copy it over. Now, there's a little challenge there, because, I mean, subscription ID is quite straightforward, but service principal ID in the output of that AZADSP command is called client ID and client secret or client password or something. So it's sometimes a little bit challenging to map the terminology, but it shouldn't all be that hard. You got 4 GUIDs as an output, and you're just going to copy them over. And from here, it means that this project can communicate with the Azure backend and run the pipeline. On top of that, if I go back to my Azure AD, oh, I was still there. And I was in my fast car case project. You know that I log fast cars, so that's one of my demo scenarios. Now, what I can do from here is similar to where we started like 30 minutes ago. This is just an identity object. So I could dive into this object and I can specify permissions. Now, not really from here, but if I want to make sure that my pipeline can only touch specific resource groups, I could dive in my fast car deploy, access control, where now instead of defining, hey, Peter, admin, these are the permissions for you, I could now allocate a role assignment to that service principal up here. Where now if I search for PE tender, fast car, there we go. That's the unique object of my service connection in Azure DevOps, where now I could specify like, no matter what happens when you run the pipeline, even if there's a mistake in your DevOps project or you target the wrong resource group, where you might override certain resources or maybe change settings or whatnot, where now you could log down like Azure DevOps, you kick off the pipeline, and you can only touch this resource group.
You know where that's really
the Peter admin account.
You know where I find that to be really big, to be honest with you, is to be able to know when you have different working environments. So if you have like a dev environment, QA environment, a test environment, or I should say a prod environment, setting up identities to do this kind of automation from, say, like Azure DevOps, when you push a new change, making sure that the right identity is associated with the right particular environment will keep you from incorrectly deploying something from, say, that you wanted to just put on QA or dev, rather than it going into prod, because it won't be able to. There's different credentials. And so we've got a question, Peter, if you got a second.
Cool. Sure.
Okay, so here's a question. Which one is more secure, a service principal or a managed identity for deploying your infrastructure? What's your opinion here?
Well, I would say managed identity, and I'll talk about it we got about 20 minutes left, I guess.
Yeah.
So, we're like literally building up, right? We started with user, Peter, admin account-like scenarios, now moving to service principals, or even like the Kubernetes scenario, like using an Azure resource to hand out permissions. Now, there is one main difference, although, again, they're all doing similar things, but there's one main difference that's like ultimately why you should use managed identities. It's not the only option, but I'm not going to expose that little secret yet, because that would blow the last 15 minutes away.
Yeah.
So I would like to build it up, but very good question, and it's one that like comes up all the time.
Thank you so much, Prathamesh. We really appreciate you taking part.
Cool question. Remind me if I forget about it, although I probably won't, but you'll never know, right? Let's see. I'll show you something else with service principals. So imagine I have a web application that's interacting with Azure AD, which means I want to make sure that whenever my users are connecting to the web app, they need access to the application, forcing authentication. I mean, nothing new. We've been doing that for so long. But next to that, why not reading out information from Azure AD? So one example I have is up here. And obviously there's a reason.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
There is a reason why I'm not exposing everything, because again, my service principal information that you see up here. So it's in my application app settings file. So it's a .NET application, but could be Python, could be Java, could be Node, doesn't really matter. It's all coming back to the same concept. And what I'm doing here is starting up my app. And whenever my app is coming up, I'm going to force users to authenticate. So that's up here, where this is the instance name, which means when your app is asking for credentials, they need to come from login.microsoftonline, which is the web URL for Azure AD. Next, you can specify specific domains. So in this case, this is my personal domain. It's linked to my email address, so no secrets there. It means that anyone from my PDTIT organization can use the app if I'm trying to log on with my PE tender at Microsoft. It's not working. Why not? Because I'm telling the only domain that can be accepted during the authorization will be this specific domain. If you don't specify it, it means that any Azure AD user can log on as long as they provide consent. Now, to provide permissions to my app that's running on Azure, but even that is not important, it means that the app itself is reaching out to Azure AD for example, reading out your profile, like first name, last name, email address, or anything else you want to read out from your users. So that's a little piece of magic that's built in. Takes you 4 clicks in your .NET application in Visual Studio, but it's coming back to that service principle. And the outcome, let's see if it still runs. Should give me some.
So you're getting your Blazor test, from what I can see. It's a little small, but I can see that right now it's doing a build server.
Oh yeah,
creation.
it's running the build down here. Well,
Great.
Just while this is running, so I'm not a developer, and I was like, well, maybe it's about time after working in IT for 25 years to maybe do a little bit more on the development side. And then looking into Blazor was one of the upcoming technologies, but not really upcoming, it's already there,
Sure.
where it's all based on .NET, and I think it's still worthwhile to learn a little bit about .NET in the Microsoft world. But it's pretty cool. I managed to build this app in 2 weeks during Christmas holidays. That's where I started. In meantime, it's going up. So you can see here that when it's starting up, it's connecting to that Microsoft authentication mechanism, Azure AD, using OAuth. That's the protocol. And I'm authenticated. And then the little gimmick I have is show my profile. That's it. Nothing special. I mean, it's what we all do within specific applications. Now, the magic that's probably more important is coming from Azure AD, where we have app registration. It's specific service principle alike something, where before I used it for my DevOps pipeline, where now I'm using it for my Blazor example. And what I can specify here, so there is my app ID, there's the tenant ID, similar to the output again that we talked about earlier for the pipelines, or the output for the Kubernetes cluster. But what we can do here is specifying what is the permission that the app has, the Azure AD object, to communicate with other applications. So I'm using Microsoft Graph. That's what we use to read out user profile information. I mentioned first name, last name, email address, anything else. But from here, you can do a lot more as well. So Microsoft Graph, it's basically interacting with Microsoft 365 overall. If you want to read out email, if you want to build your own custom to-do app, or like a calendar app, if you're not using Outlook, for example, but maybe a line of business application. But from here, you could also define interaction with other Azure components. And it's not the user getting the permission, it's the web app itself getting that permission. So it's like a user impersonation-alike scenario where the app is reaching out to the backend, again, based on specific permissions. So it's like RBAC, but for app registrations.
Really, really useful.
Really cool stuff. And again, super powerful. Let's see. Did I cover everything? Service principles, user service principles. No, go ahead.
Little managed identities?
Yeah.
Yeah, we got about 15 minutes left. And if you're watching and you want to give us a question before we get this 15 minutes up, you can go ahead, put it in the chat. And I just want to remind everybody that we do have our poll going on, and we want to make sure that you are part of it. Remember the poll: do you have Azure Managed Identities configured for your deployment process? Let us know. We want to know a lot about what you're doing. So
cool. So user admins, group admins. Next, we talked about service principals. So why not closing with managed identities? So it's still part of the same Azure identity scenario. It's still some kind of identity object. But the main difference is that the managed identity can be linked to an Azure resource. So a couple of scenarios where you can use it. Let's say I'm going back to my original example, my e-commerce solution. It's running on virtual machines, but I'm slightly moving into Azure Platform Services. So I could move my SQL Server database that's running inside a virtual machine today, moving that into SQL Azure, where now it means that my virtual machine needs permissions to communicate with SQL Azure. Or my web app needs access to Key Vault. I didn't do a demo on Key Vault yet. I'm definitely going to do that. Where, let's say, your AKS Kubernetes cluster needs access to Key Vault to read out a container database. If I would move my e-commerce web app into Kubernetes running container, it means that the web instance, my container instance coming up, like, hey, I'm going to reach out to Key Vault, grab that SQL password because I'm not going to hard code it anymore in my app settings config file. So that would be the scenario. Now, to show you what it does, and that should immediately answer the question we got earlier. So what we can do is go into, for example, web apps. Let's do something with web apps first. Or functions, even more mind-blowing technology, serverless. So there's no admin account. There's no underlying system anymore. It just runs. So I'll do functions and
API driven. All API driven.
Like super cloud magic. That's how I typically describe it. So I got a function. It's like simulating a toll booth, like an automatic parking lot system, where my function, so imagine I got like, I don't know, 5 cars every hour passing by, but then it's moving up to 50 cars, 5,000 cars during the holidays. And I'm moving from a traditional client server scenario or a monolith application into functions, where the benefit is that if I'm not running the function, which means there's no cars passing by because nobody's like parking at a, I don't know, shopping mall parking lot during the middle of the night because the shops are probably not open. Or even during the pandemic, shops are not really open, at least not in Belgium. So why would you spend a lot of compute resources and not really using the system, right? So we moved this into serverless compute, and my functions are reading out like a license plate. There's a little camera taking a picture, integrating with Azure AI, and recognizing the license plate characters. From there, it's storing information in a database. I'm using Cosmos DB, but more important, like how are all those bits and bytes coming together? Now, Cosmos DB is just requiring or offering a database connection string. So if I dive into my app settings, you're going to see that I'm using Key Vault, where I'm storing blob connection. I'm storing my API, artificial intelligence key for reading out my license plates. I'm authenticating to Cosmos DB and some event grid for the more optimized way of handling my functions. Now, in a non-Key Vault scenario, let's maybe explain that for a second. If I go to Cosmos DB, let's do a new tab to speed it up a little bit. No, not this one. I said speed it up a little bit and then using the wrong website. Smart Peter.
And hey, everybody, we got 10 minutes left. And so reminder, take poll and ask your questions while we have this opportunity to talk to Peter.
So within my Cosmos DB, it's running up here. I could read out the connection string, and in your app settings, similar to what I showed you with my Blazor app, you could move this into a connection string, right? Needing username, database admin account, password, those kind of like secret credentials. So what we're doing is, I'm not going to wait for this, but moving it into Key Vault. Where I have a specific Key Vault resource for my Tholboot app, a little bit similar to the logic around one service principal for one functionality. I would recommend one Key Vault with all the secrets for that particular application. So in here, I have my SQL admin, and I have my blob storage account connection string. I got my Cosmos DB connection string. That's the idea. Now, to make sure that not just anything in Azure get access to the actual keys, we need to rely on specific permissions. So what we're going to do is diving in to our key. That's where my little secret is stored. But the nice thing with Key Vault is that I cannot see the secret, not because this is blanked out, which, by the way, it's a functionality in the browser for the ones who are doing demos like I'm doing all the time. There's this little something up here. Let's see if it's showing the name. AZ Mask. And what it allows you to do is, once you run it as a plugin in your browser, works in Edge, obviously, works in Chrome, works in Firefox, I guess. But what it does is blanking out like anything that's a little bit secretly without doing anything. So we're not exposing anything. If I turn it off, this is not really a secret, so that's perfectly fine. I can turn it off for now, and it's going to show me like this is the link to your Key Vault resource. But pretty cool if, again, you need to record sessions or you're publishing content like we're doing right now, and you don't want to make sure.
You're going to have to send me that plugin so I can add it into my browser.
Way cool. It's called AZ Mask, so if you go for the extensions, you'll probably find it somewhere.
Very cool.
But apart from that, let's go back to the Key Vault permissions, where Key Vault is a little bit weird, I would say. For quite a while, since day one, when we introduced Key Vault, it was relying on its own access policies, where since a few weeks, we actually moved to integrating with Azure RBAC, what we already talked about multiple times. So what it means is you create Key Vault. Typically, your security team, your security officer creates it. They also create the actual content, like storing the actual database connection string, the Azure storage account connection string, those kind of ideas. Where next you're going to hand out permissions to your function, your web app, your virtual machine, like, hey, reach out to Key Vault, grab the key. But the nice thing is that you never know the actual secret itself. So to do that, option one is adding an access policy. Now, to make sure that we can integrate in this kind of scenario, that's where we need a managed identity. So what we did is moving into our Azure resource, in this case, a function. I can show you the same for a VM or anything else, where you enable a system-assigned identity. There's two different options. You got system-assigned, you got user-assigned, and I'll explain that in the last couple of minutes. Now, what we're doing with system-assigned, it's creating this object ID, like a service principal, like an app registration, the exact same thing. Where next you're going to define, hey, function app, you're the resource. I'm now turning you into an identity object. And next to that, I'm going to give you permissions to do something in the Azure platform. In this example, reading out Key Vault. That would be the idea. And that's how my function app, if I go back to my function app, So that's where now my function app configuration settings, instead of storing them hard coded, including like a SQL database, user account, password, or any other secret object that you want to store, I'm still reusing the same information. But this time, instead of having it hard coded, I'm going to hand it out to Key Vault. But to make sure that not just anyone can connect to Key Vault, or not just any resource can connect to Key Vault, we're going to reuse the RBAC concept specifically for the Key Vault object. That would be the main scenario. Now, walking you through the last example I have.
Yep, we got about less than about 3 minutes.
Perfect. So I got 2 web VMs, 2 SQL VMs. Why? I want redundancy of my e-commerce application. It's running in 2 different regions, West Europe, Central US. I got customers all over the place. And I want to make sure that European customers get directed to Europe, Azure region, and US customers are using the US part of my environment. So pretty straightforward, multiple regions, but it also means multiple Azure resources. Where next, my web VM, let's see which one I'm using, 52, that's probably this one up here. So this is my web VM. And what I have on my web VM is, like any good application, it's running on the initpub wroot. It should be in a different folder, but just a demo setup, so nothing to worry about. I got my app settings. It's not about the app settings, but what you probably see is the name of my database.
Bring it up there. Sure. There's a connection string, source
the local admin, and password. Oh my God, I'm showing passwords in a recorded session. I don't care. The credentials are on GitHub. Oh no, actually not anymore, because GitHub is smart enough and recognizing secrets now. So that's not really working anymore. It's in the documentation that I used a long time ago when I deployed this, and in my previous Microsoft life, my previous life before Microsoft, I was using this as a lab scenario, and the documentation is still on GitHub. So that's perfectly fine. Now,
so should we go ahead and take a look at the end of our poll? Because we're just down to our last minute and a half, and I want to make sure that we see where we, let's see, there we go. So here's our poll that we just finished up, and we'll add this for a second. So are you using Azure Managed Identities for your deployment process? And it's a 50-50 split. So thanks everybody for taking part in the poll this week. Peter, so if people want to find you here, there, or wherever, where can they do that?
Well, there's a couple of options. So I'm quite active on Twitter, and my tweet handle is PDTIT. I'm not that active the last couple of weeks because I was busy with some other stuff, but I have my own technical blog on 007ffflearning.com.
Okay.
Or you could shoot me an email, petender@microsoft.com.
Very cool. So, Peter, thank you so much for joining me today. We're right up on the end of it. And I want to make sure everybody at LearnTV gets their next episode. We'll see what's coming up next. I believe it is South Africa, a spotlight on community. Make sure you take a look at that. Hey, Peter, thank you again. Let's give everybody a good big wave goodbye. And I will see you all next week with another episode of Azure FunBytes. Peter's been my guest, and you all have been my guests as well. So thank you all for watching as always. We're going to see you next time. Everybody have a great rest of your week. And remember, take care of yourself.